Kwe, Nin Gadalanan Maltai, Weligisko. Hello, my name is Catherine Martin, and it's a beautiful day, and I'd like to welcome everybody to the unceded territory of my ancestors and our families today, of the Mi'kmaq, of the Ulnu, the people of this territory who have lived here for over 14,000 years. And in keeping with the tradition of my ancestors and to honor the Treaty of Peace and Friendship of 1752, I want to welcome everybody to come and be with us, share our land, a land that we have never given up, we have never been conquered for, and we have never signed away any of our rights and freedoms. We've only agreed to live in peace and friendship and welcome all people to share in our land. I'd like to sing a chant that Sarah Denny, an Eskosoni elder who's passed on, however, spent her life teaching all of us how to welcome people to the territory and what chants we are to sing when we do this. This is called Guanu Day. Ways of our people and our culture and our traditions has maintained its time with us through our oral history and the good thinking of our ancestors who always made a decision, thinking 7 generations ahead and 7 generations before them, before they would make that decision. So I'd like to honor my ancestors and once again welcome everybody to the land of the Ulnu, to the Mi'kmaq and DalhouseU.
Good evening. For those of you who do not know me, I am Teresa Rejak-Tari, Dalhousie's Vice Provost for Equity and Inclusion. We opened the forum with a Mi'kmaq welcome by Dalhousie's Director for Indigenous Community Engagement, Catherine Martin, as Dalhousie University sits on the ancestral, unceded, and unsurrendered territory of the Mi'kmaq Nation. We are all beneficiaries of the Peace and Friendship Treaty and would like to pay respect to the elders. The Office of the Vice Provost for Equity and Inclusion also acknowledges the histories, contributions, and legacies of the African Nova Scotian people and their communities who have been here for over 400 years and pay our respect to their elders. Welcome, everyone. Today's episode of our Speak Truth to Power Forum marks our one-year anniversary as it coincides with the horrific killing of George Floyd on May 25, 2020. The forum itself is steeped in the pain that we were all witnessing in the news and experiencing in our own lives at that time. Some of us at Dalhousie felt that we needed to speak out, speak the truth from our various perspectives, educate anyone willing to learn about social justice issues, and partner with the communities most affected. It was and is our hope that the forum in some way can enact change or at a minimum instill greater understanding, compassion, and knowledge. While the forum began with a focus on anti-Black racism, other injustices called out for our attention. While George Floyd called for his mother in his last breath on the streets of Minneapolis, in a Canadian hospital, an Indigenous mother of 7, Joyce Yuan, asked for help, and in the last heart-wrenching minutes of her breath, video recorded racist slurs directed towards her. Unfortunately, while the COVID pandemic is new, the racist pandemic is not. But what has been going on for decades, and what influenced Motown singer Marvin Gaye 50 years ago to ask the same question that we are asking today: what's going on? In his lyrics, Marvin observed that there were too many mothers crying and far too many brothers dying. In the past year, as many of us took to the streets for Black Lives Matter, we also had to self-isolate as we battled the COVID pandemic. But here again, we witnessed the impact of systemic racism on the health of Black and Indigenous populations and BIPOC groups as a whole. For example, while the month of May this month has been designated by the Canadian government in 2002 as Asian Heritage Month to celebrate the contributions of Asian Canadians, we also witnessed a rise in anti-Asian racism during the COVID-19 pandemic, with many of the incidents involving people physically attacking, spitting, or coughing on Asian Americans, Asian Canadians. Dear panelists and attendees, what's going on? Why are some of us treated as if we have no humanity? Or on the flip side, why are some groups' humanity, intellect, education, culture, ways of knowing and living treated as more valuable? We sometimes talk about conscious and unconscious bias as possible reasons for some to be intentionally or unintentionally left out or harmed. But is bias, racism, and discrimination of all kinds just about the disadvantages of some? Or is it also about normalized systemic privileges? I come back to Marvin Gaye's song, What's Going On? Marvin, please, don't punish me with brutality. Talk to me. This is the 7th episode of what we, 3 women volunteers and myself, and let me call their names, April, Amina, and Rial, thought was going to be a one-off. Instead, the series and the themes grew, and we made space at the table for African Americans, Black Canadians, African Nova Scotians, Indigenous peoples, LGBTQ2SI+, the Asian community, and other underrepresented groups. We pride ourselves on being inclusive of campus and community, faculty, staff, students, community leaders, and social activists. It is within this tradition that tonight our panel, who will discuss has the needle moved on systemic racism in the past year comprised of Dr. Derrick R. Brooms. Dr. Brooms is a professor and chair of sociology and affiliate faculty in Africana Studies at the University of Cincinnati, and also serves as a youth worker as well. Derrick was here in our first episode, so welcome Derrick once back to Canada and to Dalhousie. Through his research, teaching, service, and community collaborative work, Dr. Brooms is committed to educational equity, inclusion, and racial justice. His research primarily focuses on the lived experience and education of Black boys and men. His current research project, tentatively titled, But Can We Live?, where he examines Black men's experiences with and the perspectives on anti-Blackness, racial profiling, and the ongoing killing of Black boys and men. Our second panelist is Savanna. She has a Bachelor of Social Work and is a student in the Masters of Social Work at Dalhousie University. Savanna is a first-generation immigrant, and we are proud to have her as a Dalhousie student, and we are proud to have her on this panel. Third, we have DeRico Symonds. DeRico is a fearless advocate for racialized and marginalized communities in Halifax. He is the IDA advisor for the BIPOC Tribe Network and Innovation Hub. He's also the first inaugural director of Opportunity and Belonging at NASCAD. He is a founding member of 3 nonprofit organizations in Halifax, ACCE HFX, Game Changer 90, and CLT 902. DeRico holds an undergraduate degree in Child and Youth Study and an MEd in Counseling through Acadia University. DeRico also has his Canadian Counseling certification through the Canadian Counseling and Psychotherapy Association of Canada. According to DeRico, if we all do a little, nobody has to do a lot. Next panelist is Vanessa Fells. Vanessa was born into a large family in the African Nova Scotian community of Yama. Her family believed that in order to support her community, you need a good education, economic freedom, and to be a critical thinker. Taking this to heart, she completed 2 bachelor's degrees in 6 years and then completed a Master's of Education in Afrocentric Policy in 2013. In 2015, Vanessa represented Canada at the United Nations Human Rights Fellowship Program for the International Decade for People of African Descent in Geneva, Switzerland. Vanessa is dedicated to enhancing and advancing the community, and she is the Director of Operations for the African Nova Scotia Decade for People of African Descent Coalition. Our last panelist is Dr. Pamela Palmater. She's a professor and chair in Indigenous Governance, Department of Political and Public Administration at Ryerson College. Dr. Palmater is a Mi'kmaq lawyer whose family originates from the Eel River Bar First Nation in northern Brunswick. Although Dr. Palmater is at Ryerson, she is a Dalhousie graduate. She completed her doctorate in the Science of Law at Dalhousie University Law Faculty in 2009. Her thesis is entitled Beyond Blood, Rethinking Aboriginal Identity and Belonging. Dr. Palmater worked for the federal government on Aboriginal issues for over 10 years. She has several positions as Director of Indian and Northern Affairs, managing treaties, claims, self-government, land and registration portfolios. She also worked and volunteered with national and provincial Aboriginal organizations and communities. Dr. Palmater was one of the 23 visionary women leaders selected to meet and answer the question, what do 23 women envision for our country for the next 150 years? She's here tonight to also share her vision on systemic racism and the Indigenous community. Before I introduce our first speaker, there are a few housekeeping notes. First, We will be inviting our guest speakers to join in accordance with the program. Everyone's cameras and microphones have been turned off to ensure that only our guests are on the screen. The chat feature has been disabled, but attendees can place their questions in the Q&A channel. We also did receive some questions prior. We will try and ask as many questions as we can, sometimes grouping them, but we may not be able to get all, so we ask for your understanding. You can get closed captioning by clicking on the CC icon. As this is a virtual event, it is possible that we may experience technical difficulties. We appreciate your patience if this may occur. Lastly, this event is live streamed and recording as an educational tool for future reference. At some point, we will post this link in the Q&A box. So without further ado, I want to invite our first speaker, Dr. Brooms. Dr. Brooms, tell us what is happening in the US. There's so much debate that goes against or for systemic racism, while at the same time, they're trying to remove the voting rights of people who have fought for years for that right. Please share your experience with us.
Thank you, Dr. Rajak Talley. Thank you so much for inviting me out. I'm particularly grateful knowing that I participated in this event last year when we spoke in the aftermath of the killing of George Floyd. And so I'm here today and I'm excited to be joined by my colleagues and partners who are really representing some of the best work that we can really put forward. And at the same time, I'm coming with a heavy heart, right? Because the realities are still very real and they're very heavy. So I really appreciate that you opened us up with Marvin Gaye's words, question, what's going on? Because I think that, you know, as people of color here in the United States, I think this is a question that somebody in our community is asking every day, especially as we think about systemic racism and what that means for our lived experiences. And so when I think about systemic racism, I'm thinking about the ways in which racism is embedded in institutions, as well as laws and regulations, and then of course, within and across society. And so as I'm thinking about what's going on, I'm also want to hold space for the fight for racial justice must continue. So even as we think about some of the progress that we've made, and I'll highlight a few things, this is by no means an opportunity for us to say that, you know, we don't have more work to do. So we've made tremendous progress in the United States here, just even in the past year. We can look at the historic election of Kamala Harris as the Vice President of the United States. We've seen a number of Black women be elected to mayors in cities as the first time for Black women to be elected into those positions. We've seen tremendous progress across our educational institutions. I've mentioned a little bit here in politics. We've seen some advancements across various components of our lives. And I think we ought to take time to celebrate those moments of progress. And I say that very particularly because these are moments. Because at the same time that we do make progress, what we've also seen is tremendous efforts in ways that our efforts have been stagnated, deflected, and arrested. Right? And what do I mean by that? And you pointed out a little bit of this, right? And so at the root of what we're talking about is that systemic racism is violence, right? It's violence, and we also want to know and remind ourselves that it doesn't always kill, so violence isn't always fatal, but violence is intended to damage and or hurt. And so what we know through very painful experience of anti-Asian, anti-Black, anti-Latinx, anti-Indigenous racism, right, is that this includes racial disdain, dehumanization, and other forms of violence, as well as state-sanctioned violence and hatred, right? And so I'd like to just take a moment to offer a little bit of historical perspective, because I think that if we want to ask what's going on and how do we make sense of what's transpired in the last year, we know that the last year doesn't exist in a silo, right? It doesn't exist in isolation. So here in 2021, not only is this the year after George Floyd's killing, we also know that this is the 100-year anniversary of the burning of Black Wall Street in Tulsa, Oklahoma. What does it mean to pursue racial justice, knowing that we still have the scars and wounds of our family members, elders, and ancestors being racially violated through state-sanctioned violence? We know that there's ongoing immigration crisis and violence at the U.S. southern/southwestern border, right, where young children are still being separated from their families.
I'm sorry, I think we lost Derrick for a little bit there. Are you back, Derrick? Are you back?
I'm back.
Okay.
Can you all hear me?
Yeah, we can. Sorry about that.
No, so of course the funny thing is that I mentioned to Vanessa that our video is going to cut out when we did our trial run, and of course it cuts out while I'm talking. I'll be a little bit brief here just to make sure that we stay on a time schedule. I was just mentioning the ongoing immigration crisis and violence that's happening at our U.S. southwestern border, where children are still being separated from their families and being held in facilities that are just dehumanizing. I don't think there's another way for us to say it. You mentioned briefly, but we also know that there's ongoing anti-Asian hate that has continued to percolate this year with regards to the 6 women who were killed in Atlanta earlier this year. And we know that's connected to a very strong, long history of anti-Asian violence in this country, that we can go back to the Page Law of 1875 or the Rock Springs Massacre or the Chinese Immigration Exclusion Act in 1882, Japanese internment camps, right? So being Asian or Asian American in this country is always constantly complicated by being relegated as other, right? And that's something that we continue to see until the present day. I'm also thinking about the Flint water crisis, the oil pipeline through the Standing Rock Sioux Tribe's historical lands, the January 6th attempted insurrection on the US Capitol, the unfounded critiques and partisan pushback of using critical race theory in K-12 education in the United States. So there's been banned in states like Florida, which my colleague Ted Thornhill has written about and criticized, been banned in places like Tennessee and Texas. And we have to ask questions about these things, because what we're saying is that there's a particular form of teaching, a particular type of teaching, a particular critical perspective that we bring to teaching that we don't want our youth to be exposed to, right? And if we're saying that, then that creates some very real problems. And as Carter G. Woodson and so many others has written about, this really relegates us to this miseducation. And at the same time, as we can think about, a critical race theory approach to teaching, we also know that the current model of funding K-12 public education is itself violence, right? Because it's predicated upon mortgage assets. And so in the impoverished communities, we will never have the resources that we desperately need, because the funding structure automatically violates and mitigates that. And then, as you mentioned, Dr. Rajak Talley, we would be remiss in this U.S. kind of context if we say what's going on in the last year, what progress have we made. And as much as I want to celebrate, I will celebrate the election of Kamala Harris and others, we still know that these changes, these ongoing changes to voting rights laws, particularly as it relates to access in states like Georgia, which happen to be the swing state in the election, especially when we look at Congress and rep. So these pushbacks is historical, because this is what we've seen happen time and time again. And they're also very current, right, and contemporary. And so the work, as I mentioned right at the top, is that, it doesn't end. And so I want to take a few more moments, right? I want to thank Alicia Garza, Patricia Kalures, and Opal Tomeli for this kind of what we saw last year in response to George Floyd's killing was the direct seed from what they did in starting the Black Lives Matter movement, right? I also want to think about Khalif Browder, who would have turned 28 this year, right? I want to think about the ways in which the prison industrial complex is predicated upon the overwhelming prisoning of Black, Latinx, and other folks of color, how our police forces are trained to violate our rights. I don't want to go down that line, but violate our rights in a number of ways where they're not mediating troubles and challenges, but instead perhaps in some ways instigating them, right? And so we still, as much as we celebrated the trial of Derek Chauvin, and we had to do the work to say, this isn't the trial of George Floyd, this is the trial of Derek Chauvin, what we know is that the verdict was not racial justice, it was accountability, right? So we can't get to racial justice if we can't even get to accountability. And I think I read the statistics where Derek Chauvin was only the 8th police officer in the past 15 years who's been held accountable for wrongfully killing somebody. So while we've made some progress, we also have not made some progress. I also want to just say thank you to Darlella Frazier, who was the young person who filmed the George, what she didn't know at the time, but what ended up being the George Floyd killing, that without that video, we would not made the progress that we've made or we claim to make, or even be the country we claim to be. Because if you recall, the Minneapolis Police Department put out a statement that said, they gave a very different story. I know I don't have time to unpack that. And at the same time that we celebrated and we're, in some ways appreciative of the verdict in the Derek Chauvin case, we know that Ma'Khia Bryant in Columbus, Ohio was killed minutes before that trial verdict came out. So we've made progress in a number of ways. We still see both the individual acts, I pointed to a few of those, but they're invested in embodied in these institutions and the systems that are perpetuated on pain, suffering of people of color here in the United States. Thank you, Teresa. Lots more to say, of course, and I'm sending it back to you, and I'm looking forward to hearing from my colleagues as well.
Thank you, Derrick. These are awfully challenging and difficult conversations to have, and every time we do it, chills run up my hands. But they are important, and we will come back to the Q&A section where if you want to explore more, you can. I'd like now to pass it on to our student, Savanna, to share her perspectives on a couple of the items. Thanks, Savanna, for being here.
Thank you, Dr. Talley. Can everyone hear me? Hi, everyone. My name is Yuan, and I go by Savanna, which is what my full name means in English. As Dr. Talley introduced, I have a Bachelor of Social Work degree from Dalhousie University, and I'm completing my Master degree of Social Work also at Dal. Other than the identities above and what's visible to everyone, I'm also a first-generation immigrant. Today, I'm going to use this valuable time to briefly talk about a topic that's less commonly brought up, which is how systemic racism may have contributed to the invisibility of Asian and anti-Asian racism, together with the divide among ethnic groups. It might sound unfamiliar to some of our audience when I connect systemic racism to Asians. Like, really? Asian systemic racism? What are you talking about? I assume everyone listening to this panel has some interest in the topic of systemic racism and, of course, some sort of knowledge of ongoing anti-Asian racism from all levels, such as the blatant Chinese virus from our friendly neighbor in the South. And of course, the fans are following their idol. Sadly, there have been many violent attacks against Asians in the past year, not just on our neighbor's turf, but also in Canada. And when I connect systemic racism and Asians, one might think about, statutory or policy level and may question, did Asians ever experience slavery in a European American context? Maybe not, but if you're interested, I would like to invite you to look into the coolie trade in the 19th century. There were Asians, mainly Chinese and Indians, were forced or deceived to substitute the gradual abolition of slave trade in many countries, like European American countries. And one might also wonder, when seeing me connecting systemic racism to Asian, they may ask, have Asians ever experienced overrepresentation in criminal justice system? Not that I know today, but injustice doesn't have to come in one universal form. And again, I invite you to explore some injustice that happen to Asians on a statutory level, such as, Canada charged head tax on and only on Chinese when they immigrated. Like, they charged that for decades under the regulation of Chinese Immigration Act. And the act was introduced shortly after the completion of Canadian Pacific Railway, which costed at least 600 to 1,000 lives of Chinese labor. And you may have noticed 600 to 1,000, that's like a big range. And how come? Because no one knows exactly how many Chinese died during the construction. And that construction provided them with extremely low wage and almost zero medical care. And also, another example, if you're interested, you can look into the War Measures Act that gave Canadian federal government, the power to intern all persons of Japanese racial origin. So over 21,000 Japanese Canadians were expelled from their homes. Men are sent to labor camps. Women and children relocated to squeeze in livestock barns. And usually people seem to be unfamiliar with these facts. And I suppose many people with Asian descent are becoming increasingly unfamiliar with this part of the history. And besides the history, before moving to next topic, which is divide among ethnic groups, I would like to clarify that it's never my intention to blame anyone, since we live in this unfair system. And it is rarely an individual's fault to be less informed. Also, what I'm trying to do is to break down the facts instead of breaking down ethnical groups or comparing injustices that different ethnic groups have experienced or are still experiencing. All I'm trying to do here is I see the invisibility and I would like to share what I see, and hopefully we can have more awareness of invisibility in the context of this systemic racism. So from what I see, one of the many reasons or contributing factors of the invisibility is that Asians have been characterized as model minority and differentiated from other ethnical groups. And the notion of model minority is problematic for various reasons that I can name, but I'm not gonna go for a long list. But the first one I can come up with is it reduces an already very diverse population to a certain stereotype, even though the stereotype is probably yearned for, by people or more fit to the social norms. Asians are not the same. There's so many of us. I was mistaken as Japanese and Korean multiple times in my life, whereas my culture is very different from these mistaken identities. And even for Chinese, there are so many differences. And not all Asians are nerds or good at science. And the second reason I consider the model minority notion problematic is that human nature is already wired or evolved to categorize others and discriminate those who are different from us or different from what kind of people we want to be, because life is usually less complicated if we can just draw a conclusion based on very superficial information, such as someone's appearance. And this model minority notion does nothing but encourages discrimination and divide among the ethnical groups. Because when you think about it, when and the existence of model minority is created, what is on the opposite? Bad example. you name it. And again, I always hesitate to blame individuals for their stereotyping or discriminating behaviors, since people's behaviors are mostly, taught and reinforced by the big or small environment that they're living in. Systemic racism is like an unfair game that each member of ethnic groups is impacted. It's just a matter of extent. And in this unfair game, I consider the last thing to do is to fall into the trap that encourages ethnic groups to discriminate against each other and weaken our solidarity. So I think while recognizing the complexity and layers of systemic racism, it's also important that ethnic groups fight with each other and with all the allies against this unfair game instead of fighting against each other. So to conclude, I hope ethnic groups know better or have more knowledge about each other's history, break down the facts instead of people, since even though we're different in many sense, but in front of systemic racism, ethnic groups share more similarities than we realize. I appreciate this opportunity of people from different backgrounds, whatever background that is, we speak up and make ourselves heard. And this panel happens during Asian Heritage Month, which I consider a promotion of solidarity. Thank you everyone for listening, and Dr. Talley.
Thank you, Savanna. I am happy that we are recording this episode, and it will be posted so that people can use it for educational purposes, because we are learning a lot from the panel discussions, and you definitely contributed to that, Savanna. I would like now to introduce our next panelist, DeRico. DeRico, bring it back home. We heard Derrick's, synopsis of what is happening in the US, and oftentimes I hear that that's something from the North America, from the USA, from our southern neighbors. It's not happening here. We don't have that. We've been influenced by the discussions from the US. So please tell us about your perspective and what is happening here at home.
Absolutely. Thank you, Dr. Talley. And so during my talk here, I'm going to sort of unpack and answer sort of what has changed and a bit in terms of what have we learned. And I want to clarify as well is that I'm employed with the Office of Equity and Anti-Racism with the province of Nova Scotia. However, I want to be very clear. I'm not here representing my employer or any nonprofit organization that I'm a part of. I'm here representing myself. So I just want to be clear before I begin. So as I speak, I'd like you to think about this. Society in its entirety and in its inception was never meant to work for persons of color after colonization. This thought brings forward the explanation and understanding for why systemic racism has continued to persist. And we're here gathered in conversation because a Black man named George Floyd was murdered by police. Not only was he murdered, but he was also murdered for the world to see. He was lynched in broad daylight. He begged and he pleaded for the knee to be removed from his neck. He begged for his life. Yet, to reminisce on such an incident, such barbaric behavior, and to ask myself, what has changed? What have we learned? I would have to say that the knee on the neck of a Black man is a metaphoric representation of the everyday lives of Black people. The knee on the neck happens every single day. It happens in your place of work. It happens by our police forces here in HRM through street checks and other acts of misconduct. It happens in our schools and it happens in our communities. And to be frank, some of you do nothing and have done nothing to prevent it or stop it from happening your entire lives and will leave here and continue to do nothing. These discussions for some are a form of entertainment. If it has taken the front page murder of George Floyd to bring about allyship and to affirm what Black communities have been saying for decades, I have many questions for you. The irony of this past year is that it has taken the murder of George Floyd front page for some of you to act. And can we not see how this cycle continues to be problematic? Our reaction to the conviction for a murder with ample video evidence available speaks to how broken the system is in itself. We expected Derrick Chauvin to walk free, although we wanted and got the conviction. We have had many George Floyds before George Floyd. Michael Brown, Eric Garner, choked to death by police on video, Philando Castile, Walter Scott, Stephon Clark, Breonna Taylor, and many more. And one must ask themselves, why haven't you reacted then? Created policy, hosted conversations like this, released corporate statements in solidarity. That is the root of the issue we do not want to discuss. You have been collectively complacent. Rather than discussing the insidious, infiltrative nature of racism and white supremacy, we have lived in a continuous cycle of creating policies and best practices for issues we know exist. I'm going to run that back. We have lived in a continuous cycle of creating policies and best practices for issues we know exist. You can mandate policy, but you cannot mandate ideology. I'm often asked the question, what are solutions to end racism? And the way that I want to break this down is that being asked for solutions to an issue that I did not create, but I endure daily, is maddening and monotonous. We avoid asking the question in reverse to white folks on how they can stop being racist. And sure, it is very uncomfortable, but nothing in history that needed to be substantially changed was ever changed from a seat of comfortability. And so, what have we learned? Look to the margins of society for an accurate answer. You can judge how we're doing by looking to those who have been pushed to the margins of society. We have learned that racism is something that many white folks tolerate, and you will never change anything that you continuously tolerate. Tolerating something means that it's not affecting your life enough to want to change it. We have asked for generations for folks to stop killing us directly, stop killing us indirectly, and the response has been, yeah, but, as if our lives are up for debate. And so we have learned that substantial change will not happen ever until the issues affecting minority groups begin to affect the majority of the population. A prime example is COVID-19. COVID-19 is a good example because we've had 4 different vaccines that were produced in a matter of months, infrastructure set up, billions of dollars for CERB, digital applications, created employment and other initiatives, daily briefings and discussions around the clock and around the clock coverage. Now, these are all needed and they're all necessary because we do have a health crisis. But I want you to ponder this question. How long have we been talking about racism in general? How long have we been talking about it in our education system, in our justice system, our healthcare system? Now, who does it affect primarily? Who does racism affect primarily? Persons of color. Have we seen the substantiality and response that COVID-19 has received? I think you know the answer to that question. We have learned that our current systems are fragile. The social issues that are ailing our communities and our marginalized communities and our racialized communities have become heightened within this pandemic. We deemed who is and who is not essential. We caused homelessness and unemployment. We learned that the commodification of Black bodies is a global business. And I want people to think about this for a minute. We're wearing shirts and clothing that we have to reassert that a Black person's life simply matters. and that's up for debate. We're proudly wearing clothing that says, "I can't breathe." These are the last words of Black men before they died. Corporately, this has become a trend for CEOs and those in leadership roles to pose in these types of clothing. And so when we think about what has changed, to me, that question depends on who you ask. To accurately answer this question, I think it would depend on which group or which individual person that you're asking. And so I will answer briefly in terms of some things that I did notice and have possibly been a part of in Halifax or in Nova Scotia. And so I've seen a shift in the frequency of dialogue as it relates to racial discrimination. There's been an uptick in willingness and curiosity around the issues, policy inquiry and development, and abundance of employment opportunities in relation to equity issues, increased efforts and willingness to listen. Our municipal government of Halifax created an anti-Black racism coordinator and strategy. The Nova Scotia provincial government created an office of equity and anti-racism. And then we've had 2 historic elections one in municipal government, the most diverse that we've ever had. And that's great, but the most diverse we've ever had. We've got a long ways to go. But then as well, we've had historic appointments of many amazing Black women to provincial leadership roles. And so I may seem frustrated. I may also seem mad, and it's probably because I am. To say we did not move momentum in a good direction, that would not be truthful, and it would be an understatement from me. And it would also certainly not underscore all of the amazing work, great work, and tireless efforts that people have put forth. And so I've come to understand that my urgency for change will not be your urgency for change. It is my lived experience up against your perception of my reality. And this is something that I've said before, but I'd like to close with this. We do not do anyone or anything justice by remaining silent in the face of grave injustice, inequity, and maltreatment. There has been a time or times in everyone's life where you saw something or knew something was wrong, but you chose to do nothing. Doing nothing does nothing. Doing nothing is the acceptance of the status quo. Looking at a pile of wood for the campfire you want won't start the fire. Simply thinking about change does not create movement. We need action. And so let's not confuse movement with progress. Movement for movement's sake is not change. And so 2 things that I want to leave you with. If we all do a little bit, nobody has to do a lot alone. And carry the baton as fast and as far as you can and leave it in the best place possible for the next generation to begin the race. Thank you, and back to you, Dr. Talley.
Thank you, DeRico. I'll leave you with another one. Doing nothing is not an option for many of us. So I will now turn the virtual talking stick to Vanessa. Same question, Vanessa. Has the needle moved in the past year?
Thank you, Dr. Talley. Everybody can hear me? Good. Has the needle moved? I spent some time thinking about this. Short and simple answer, yes, but it's much more complicated and complex than that. As Dr. Brooms said, first, I'm going to celebrate, and I'm going to say that, a lot has happened in the last year. Canada and Nova Scotia unanimously passed the recognition of Emancipation Day, which, for those who don't know, is the end of the enslavement of African people in the British Empire that happened in 1834. That is something to celebrate. And so we have seen that needle move, but it has moved slowly. And so this is what I'm going to take the time to discuss. Why has it moved so slowly? And understanding those barriers and why that needle isn't progressing, at least at the rate that I would like to see and many others would like to see, I think also answers the question in how systemic racism actually works. And, everybody was traumatized, not just the African American and people of African ancestry around the world from George Floyd. The world was traumatized by seeing this killing, happen. For me, it caused me to ask questions. I saw a revival and the start of a second civil rights movement that happened globally. But it caused me to ask questions like, why did it take George Floyd's death? As DeRico said, so many deaths has happened before that. Emmett Till so long ago happened in the United States, and yet, it takes George Floyd's death before we actually see some more significant movement since the civil rights movement back in the 1950s and 60s. I wonder what had happened if it hadn't been recorded. Would Black voices have been silenced again? And I will talk about that a little bit later and how that happens. Is change really going to happen? As we said, we do see some changes, but are these changes significant enough to actually address racism and systemic racism? And really, why did it take everyone so long? Why were Black voices silenced and discredited for so long? This is not the first time, it's not the thousandth time that you have heard communities that have been disenfranchised for hundreds of years talk about racism and the trauma that it takes on their communities and themselves. So why did it take George Floyd's murder for people to actually stand up and say, hey, there's something severely wrong here and we need to talk about it? And we not only need to talk about it, but we need to actually do something substantial about it. So this is for me where we talk about that needle and systemic racism. To me, I think the greatest barrier and the greatest issue is denial. And denial is systemic racism's best friend. It's denial of the truth, denial of education, denial of racism itself. These denials allow the status quo to be upheld. It allows white supremacy to hold on to power. And as DeRico says, it allows people to become complacent and tolerant with what is actually happening. And that silences the voices of the community when we are talking about what is actually happening to us on a daily basis, which many of us are now seeing all the time because we can videotape it on our phone. And yet there's a little bit of outrage for a while and then it goes away. And that should never happen. That outrage should always stay. I'm currently rereading one of my favorite books, which I hope people have read, and if not, Dr. Joy DeGruy's Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome. And she talks about the differences in being in America and talking about racism and education and that denial, and then being in South Africa. And she talks about the fact that South Africa had a reconciliation after apartheid and how it helped for people to stop living in denial and also stop living in this fear of having that conversation about race. That's one of the biggest problems is nobody wants to talk about racism. And the first reason that people give is they're afraid that they'll be labeled as racist. And my answer back to that is, well, if you're afraid to have the conversation to begin with, how are we ever going to, again, move that needle forward? We can't. It's a stalemate. And so she talks about that, and she makes a juxtaposition between there and America, where, and even now in Canada, there is no reconciliation. We don't talk about it. As soon as an issue of race and racism happens, people become very uncomfortable. They want to change the subject. They don't want to talk about it. Again, it stops that needle from moving forward. So what I ask of people, when we have these conversations, and when I say conversations, I mean have those courageous conversations. Talk about race, talk about racism, talk about the issue. But not only talk, actively listen. And we've heard people say that again, actively listen, but what does it mean? What it means is listen to what those are, what community and what people are telling you about race and racism and the trauma that it causes communities. But don't question what they're saying. Believe it is true. Again, one of the ways that systemic racism holds itself is it allows this space for people to actually question the validity of what someone is saying when they say I was racially profiled by police. and they say, well, are you sure it was racial profiling? You're automatically silencing that voice because you're saying that that voice doesn't matter. Maybe you are mistaken. Well, my experiences are my experiences, and we shouldn't have people question whether or not my experience is valid and how I feel and the trauma that it has caused me and my community. We have to understand, especially in terms of policing, we have to understand the history. And I will talk a little bit about history and how that comes into it. But we need to understand the history of policing and policing Black bodies and how that has contributed to systemic racism. Look at the history of enslavement, segregation, sundown laws, racial profiling, and in Nova Scotia, street checks. There is a history that links all of those together. And if we don't understand that history, then we're living again in denial and saying, well, street checks isn't a big deal. We heard a lot of people in Nova Scotia say, street checks isn't a big deal. Why are you complaining that you're being stopped by police? But if you understand the history of it and how it goes all the way back to the enslavement of Black people here in the province, then you understand why it's a big deal. And again, what does denial look like? Exactly what we're saying. It's denial of letting voices be heard and validating them as true without questioning. Look at the news on a daily basis and you'll see that. Refusal of politicians to acknowledge that systemic racism exists. Even in the United States, the current refusal of the 1619 Project to be able to be taught, which talks about slavery. Here in Canada, and I will call it out, the Premier of Quebec denying that systemic racism exists. How many voices does that silence? For a person to have such political power to actually say to his province, I don't believe that systemic racism is a problem in our province. How many Black voices did he automatically silence? And how many others automatically believed him and again silence those Black voices? So really, what can be done about this? It's very complex, and it can be frustrating, as DeRico said, to keep doing this. But I'll leave you with very few, at least some recommendations on how we can keep the needle to move forward. And I believe that it's for all of us, even though we may be tired and become frustrated. As DeRico said, you know, if we work together and collectively, it will make trying to move this needle forward a little bit easier. There will be less burnout. I would like to say that, but I think sometimes we all feel burned out. But to keep the needle moving forward for this second civil rights movement, we all have a duty to face and talk about the atrocities and to openly talk about them. We need to have more education. You know, fear and denial are large tactics that are used to keep people complacent and tolerant. We need to call those out. We need to understand and have those courageous conversations. And we need to meet people where they are. Some people are not ready to have those conversations. Some people may never be ready to have those conversations. But for those who are ready, we need to meet them where they are, and we need to try and work together to understand that. Again, history and education are going to be a large, large piece. Collective policy changes, definitely. Challenge policymakers, businesses, and I'm going to say, stop seeing conversations as action. Conversations and having courageous conversations about racism and systemic racism are not action. That is inaction. Having an apology to say that systemic racism exists, but no action behind it is just words. It is inaction. We need to stop deluding ourselves and making ourselves believe that inaction is actually action. That is where my greatest frustration lies. We need to hold accountability. For us in Nova Scotia, talking about street checks, we need to make a policing strategy. We've talked about it. We need to actually do it. Collectively, we need to be together and do it. I am going to say just two more things in closing. There is a provincial election coming up here in Nova Scotia. We don't know when, but we know it's coming. If there are MLAs on the line, I have a challenge for you. What is your platform on Black Lives Matter and addressing systemic anti-Black racism? And not only what is your platform, but more importantly, what is your track record in addressing these? Because if it's just a platform, again, it's inaction that you're making to look like action. No. So lastly, I read this on Tuesday, so I'm going to leave you with wise words from the street. And when I say the street, what I actually mean is Sesame Street. And they released a statement for the 1-year recognition of George Floyd. And what they said is, racism has not a place on our street or any street. Sesame Street was built on diversity, inclusion, and especially kindness. Today and every day, we need to stand together with our Black colleagues, our partners, collaborators, and the entire Black community. We stand with our friends around the globe, and we speak against racism to promote understanding and to create a world that is smarter, stronger, and kinder. So I will turn it back over to you, Dr. Talley.
Thank you, Vanessa, for speaking truth to power. And, you know, what you say resonates in a lot of us. You know, I always tell people, don't tell me that my experience is not real. Tell me you do not know of its existence. And there's a difference there. And talking about, you know, to do nothing is not an option. And to get all these perspectives out is so important. So I want to now turn the talking stick, Dr. Palmater, to you to tell us and educate us a little bit about the Indigenous experience and from your perspective, because oftentimes you put people on the spot to represent their group. That's not what we want. We want you to share your experiences and perspectives on the same question, systemic racism. Has the needle moved? And thanks for being here.
Well, thanks so much for having me, and hopefully you can all hear me okay. Perfect. Kwe Nin Dalhousie Pam Palmater. I'm from the sovereign Mi'kmaq Nation and unceded Mi'kmaqi territory. My home community is Ugbaganjig, which is Eel River Bar First Nation. But today I am talking to you from the sovereign territory of Mississaugas of Scugog, whose land issues have never been properly addressed, nor have their treaty or other rights ever been properly respected. And I think it's really important to acknowledge the injustices no matter where we are here on Turtle Island, because for Indigenous peoples who have unique experiences, this is a critical part of systemic racism. The land theft, the resource theft, the control of our identities, the control of our communities, that is something that is very unique. And I just want to thank everybody. I just wanted to jump up and down as people were speaking. I'm madly typing notes, writing notes. I just, you know, thank you for everything that you're saying, because this isn't going to go anywhere unless even within our conversations, we have the hard conversations. And the hard conversations are the most important, because I've always said that, you know, if what you're doing feels good or it's easy, I can almost guarantee you're not doing the substantive action that's necessary. It's easy to set up committees and meetings and do cultural awareness training and all of that other stuff. But what impact is it having on the lives of the people on the ground? Not the people in the offices, but the lives of the people on the ground. And so my comments are going to relate specifically to Indigenous peoples, because every group has a very different experience of systemic racism, a different history, different sets of laws at different times and experiences. And it's important to acknowledge that, even in our powerful coming together and our solidarity, that we have to respect those different historical, political, legal, cultural, and social contexts. And you know, we all agree this isn't a race to the bottom, but it's about respecting those historical and current differences. Like genocide of Indigenous peoples on Turtle Island is different from Black slavery. It's different from Asian hate, but we may have similar experiences in terms of racial profiling with police officers, for example. So it's important to acknowledge those differences, because we do come from a different set of circumstances. And we have our own unique calls for justice. So Indigenous peoples calling for land back comes from a very different place and space and set of justices as someone else's call for something else. What's important is to respect each other's voices and come together and work together in solidarity when that works in the moment. And there are times when Black Lives Matter has to speak for Black Lives Matter and lead the way on that issue, and we are the backup and the support. And there are other times when you would see us, all of our groups coming together and speaking at the same time. And all of those things, all of the ways in which we lift each other's voices and respect the differences is how we get this done. And this kind of solidarity work isn't easy. It's like a relationship in a big family who've suffered multiple overlapping traumas that come from different places, but can have very similar impacts. And in any family, we have to work out the bumps and the conflicts and the differences to make sure that we can come together as a group, because we know we have a massive set of barriers that are ahead of us. And so for me, for Indigenous peoples, we've been engaged in centuries-long battle to end genocide, land theft, the exploitation, the marketing, the extraction of our Indigenous lands and bodies. We've been specifically engaged in having our sovereignty and laws respected, which is an entirely different conversation than equity, diversity, and inclusion. Those two things are completely separate. And those are the things that many universities and organizations and governments have a problem with. They want to lump everybody in the same category with and basically what that does is it erases our uniqueness, our different experiences, and our different calls to action. And it's not the same. So for Indigenous peoples, we're talking about nationhood, independence, self-determination. And those are very different questions, because for us, that is the only way out of ongoing genocide, which of course is based in systemic racism and misogyny and homophobia and ableism and all of those other forms of discrimination in society, but it's very targeted for a very specific purpose, because we know that the theft of land and resources is about power, control, and wealth in the hands of a few. And we know who the few are. We're talking about white supremacist elites who have created entire societies, governments, economic systems, and social norms around their supremacist ideas. And that's a hard conversation to have with people, because they have to look at themselves and their neighborhoods and their next door neighbors. It's so much easier to say, well, it's government that did the genocide, and so it's government that has to address it. Well, who do you think works for the government? Who makes up the government? Who works in hospitals? Who works on police forces? It's people in society. But this need to want to extract oneself from the problem is part of the problem itself. So you think about the way that genocide has happened to Indigenous peoples, and I'm not saying that academically or theoretically. The National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls found Canada guilty of historic and ongoing genocide. So it's not a debate. Even if people in the media want to have a debate, it's no longer a debate. It's a legal fact in this country. And so you add all of the intersectional dimensions for Indigenous peoples, how it wasn't just about our perceived race as Indigenous peoples, but also the ways in which they targeted Indigenous women and girls because of our sex as female, as ways to exploit us, use that as a way to destroy our nations, shows that we can't even just look at racism exclusively based on race. There's multiple intersectional levels, of sex and, like I said, homophobia and ableism that just makes it like a much more significant challenge. And the other thing is that this has not been an accident. The way Americans and Canadians are taught about what happened to tribes in the US and First Nations here in Canada, it's this manifest destiny. It's this inevitable clash of cultures, as if it was a cultural problem. And we all know it's not a cultural problem on our part. That, some people may have died off by disease, but inevitably, these things happen with contact. And that's a complete miseducation of what has happened. We're talking about purposeful, intentional Indian policy in Canada and the United States that had as its mission to acquire all of our lands and resources, and then minimize any financial obligations that they acquired through treaties or other agreements. And they only ever had two methods. And this is on the books, government books. It was the elimination or assimilation. And they would do that by any means necessary. And that could be scalping bounties on Mi'kmaq people in what's now known as Nova Scotia. It could be forced sterilizations. It could be outright murders. It could be ethnic cleansing, the starvation policies of First Nations across the country, all of the laws which trapped people on reserves so they couldn't hunt and fish. I mean, the criminalization of our identity. It was a crime to be Native, to practice our ceremonies, to go hunt and fish. Even today, what's the number one reason why Indigenous peoples are targeted by the RCMP or other police officers? Because we're hunting, we're fishing, we're gathering, we're protecting our lands from environmental destruction, protecting our waters, or protecting our peoples. So our whole way of being is still very much criminalized. And so racism doesn't even cover that. I mean, when you think about it, when you criminalize an entire entity, a whole segment of the population, because it serves an economic and political purpose, and the people in Canada and the US benefit from it. Whether you arrived 200 years ago, 300 years ago, or yesterday, if you step foot on this continent, you benefit from ongoing genocide and the dispossession of Indigenous peoples in this country. And again, that's a hard conversation to have because people would like to think of it as an abstract. Well, look, it's the Indian Act. The Indian Act did all this. There's nothing in a piece of paper in any Indian Act ever that said you need to forcibly sterilize women. You need to try to cut down the population. You need to make sure that, you know, they never make it out alive. Nothing in the Indian Act says or does that. It's people that do that. When we talk about bureaucracies, those are people. Those are your neighbors. That's your mom, your dad, your brothers, your sisters, the people you know in your neighborhood, in your community. And sometimes it's even racialized people who are part of that process. And that's another really hard conversation to have, because just like the women's movement, you know, when women were fighting for equality and fighting for women's rights, part of what hurt the women's movement were women who made it past the glass ceiling, but then perpetuated the same discrimination and dispossession and all of those things that they experienced so that they could get ahead, you know, so that they could benefit. And those conversations within our groups, within our solidarity groups, are conversations that are happening, but they're very difficult. So to answer the question, has the needle moved in the last year? Well, I think it depends on which needle you're referring to. If you're referring to the political rhetoric, the thoughts and prayers, the taking a knee, the cultural awareness training, the meetings, the committees, the events, yes, the superficial needle has moved. Great. What has that done for the people on the ground? Are there less police brutality of Black and Indigenous peoples? Is there less police killings of Black and Indigenous peoples? Are there less sexualized violence, rapes, sexual assaults being committed by police and corrections officers against Black and Indigenous peoples? Absolutely not. If you're talking about the needle that measures health, safety, and well-being of Indigenous peoples, that needle has statistically actually moved backwards in the last year. And not just because of pandemic-related issues, but incarceration rates of Indigenous peoples continue to be the highest in this country, and they continue to skyrocket. And the fastest growing prison population, Indigenous women. Foster care rates still at crisis levels. Murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls continues unabated. Human trafficking, child porn rings, and other abusive practices that exploit Indigenous women and girls continue without abatement. Poverty and homelessness in First Nations rises year after year after year after year. We today have the highest poverty rate of First Nations children than we've ever had in our society. The Indian Act still excludes thousands of First Nations women and children from their home communities. Police killings continue to increase of Indigenous peoples. And if you can imagine, forced and coerced sterilizations and abortions still happen to Indigenous women and girls. And racism is so prevalent in healthcare that Indigenous peoples are suffering higher rates of neglect, physical injury, and death at the hands of the healthcare system. So I want to make sure that I don't use up too much of my time, but I did want to say that for my perspective, if you look at all of the ways in which we would measure health, safety, well-being of Indigenous peoples, everything has gotten worse. And that's because it's been normalized, justified, explained, neglected, and denied. Denied about who is doing the racist acts, who's responsible to change the racist acts, and whether or not, in fact, there's any desire to change the status quo, which benefits the majority of the population and the government. So the hard conversation we need to have is silence is violence. It's called willful blindness. Society knows what's happening. It used to be 40 years ago, we said, oh, it's ignorance, people don't know, they were taught that way. But every survey that's been done in Canada in the last 40 years shows that the majority of Canadians know that there is racism against Indigenous peoples. They know about the violence, they know about the discrimination, yet they do nothing. And that is my issue. They will watch it on TV, hear it on the radio, see it on social media. It's almost like a spectator phenomena. There isn't anyone in Canada who doesn't know about this for the most part. Yet Canadians, relatively speaking, have the wealth, the education, the power, the influence to take action and demand change. Think about them. They're the doctors, the lawyers. They're the ones that own all this massive corporations. They're the ones in government. They literally have the power to change this, and they don't. And so for us, we've been talking about racism that kills Native people for decades, with the Marshall Inquiry in Nova Scotia, 1989, the Manitoba Justice Inquiry, 1999, the Stonechild Inquiry, 2004, Ipperwash Inquiry, 2007, and then 2019, the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls, which said Canada, its levels of government and society are responsible for the high rates of violence and deaths of Indigenous women and girls. We are 2 years past the inquiry, and no plan to end genocide in Canada. That is the answer to whether or not our lives are valued. That is systemic racism in action. And all I can say is, you know, my heart is with Chantel Moore, Rodney Levi, Aisha Hudson, Neil Stonechild, Frank Paul, JJ Harper, Eric Garner, and all of the people who have been brutalized, incarcerated, sexually violated, or killed by police officers, people in society, or state-sanctioned violence.
Thank you, Dr. Palmater. Some of the things that resonate from the conversation, and I think Savanna touched on it and you touched on it a little bit, everybody did, is that the importance of learning about each other's history. You know, and since I've been in this position on here, our director for Indigenous Community Engagement has been educating me. I'm a perpetual student. And one of the things that she had me read was this one here. I don't know if you could see it. It's called 21 Things You May Not Know About the Indian Act. And believe me, when I was reading it, I could see the mirror image of the African American history, starting from the slave era, Jim Crow, the New Deal, GI, up to the current situation with the Voting Act. And it made me think while we were having this conversation, has the needle moved? And from the conversation, I can see that some people push the needle forward, some people sit back and do nothing, but they do have others, and the two histories have taught me this, that when the needle moves forward on the clock, then a new clock is created when the needle is way somewhere else. So every time we make progress, the rules and the policies and the structures are recreated to maintain the same status quo. And the other thing that resonated, which leads me to the question, we have a couple questions. One that was submitted prior and a few in the box is, and you alluded to it, Dr. Palmater, why is it so hard to talk about racism? You know, and I want to start with Derrick, if you can share some of your perspective on this. Why is it so difficult to talk about this?
Thank you for that, Dr. Rajak Talley. Can you hear me? Okay. So I first of all, I got 4 pages of notes over here. So I want to thank my colleagues for just what I call making it plain, right? And so when I think about this question, even as I'm trying to formulate this response, and I'm thinking about what Dr. Palmater just said. I'm thinking about what Vanessa said. I'm thinking about Savanna. So I just want to make it plain, right? That in North America, right, we're talking about colonial settler states. Right? We can't talk about racism because, as Vanessa mentioned, right, there's this staunch denial, but I would argue it's a little bit more than that, right? I would argue that part of the reason why we can't talk about racism is because to talk about racism is to, in some way, acknowledge the damning effects that it has on people's lives, right? And so, you know, when DeRico was talking, one of the things I was writing feverishly, if it's hard to talk about race, just think about this, right? I've had colleagues in higher education say, I don't want to teach a course on race because it's hard to talk about race. And these happen to be people who identified as white. If it's hard to talk about it, as DeRico called us into, what does it mean to live it on an everyday basis, 24 hours a day, right? So that when I hear young men that I work with and talk with say, man, they killed Trayvon and that hurt. They killed Mike Brown and that hurt because that could have been me. Because we've had interactions with police officers, neighborhood folk, right? People who have adorned themselves as neighborhood watch, not even officially, right? As Dr. Palmater talked about, who would continuously surveil our presence just in the space, which means that we are always already under scrutiny, under surveillance, and never belong, right? So we can't talk about racism because talking about racism says we've got to acknowledge an awareness that racism is bad. Now, to me, that's like elementary. Like I can tell that to a 2-year-old, right? But here's some of the real things. Racism, as I mentioned, is predicated upon violence, right? Racism is never neutral. So if racism is never neutral, that means that on the one hand, that there are people who continuously on an everyday basis, as Dr. Palmater mentioned, just from their breathing, gain advantages and privileges. Just cause. You ain't did nothing, just cause. That's not the end of it. Because what it also means is that I am going to hurt, right? I'm going to be violated. I'm going to be dehumanized. I am going to suffer. So at the same time that some folks are gaining advantages and privileges, it also means at the same time, as DeRico mentioned very clearly, or talked about very clearly, I've got to be in suffering because of racism, right? And this is why we have to talk about it at the systemic level, right? We can point, we all did. We can point to individual cases, but the individual cases are connected to the systemic, right? So that Breonna Taylor still and her family has no accountability for her killing for an illegal no-knock warrant that actually found the officers guilty for the bully that went through the wall of the next apartment, but not the one that killed Breonna Taylor, right? So when we talk about like say her name, it's because there are systems in place that has continuously dehumanized, invalidated, and punished Black women for their very presence in this country, right? And so, when we think about the advantages that people accrue on an everyday basis, that these can be, called on to abuse, violate, dehumanize, and normalize our suffering. So folks don't want to have that conversation because it means to acknowledge that. And once we acknowledge it, we get to hold you accountable. So as DeRico mentioned, listen, we can't have no reconciliation if we ain't even talking about having a conversation. What you gonna reconcile, what you ain't even willing to talk about, right? Last point here. Nipsey Hussle, great urban guru who was killed, of course, in LA area, he says, listen, we are not the cause, we are the effect. So if you have a problem with us going to the streets, if you have a problem with us protesting the continuous killing of our people, if you have commentary and critique for quote unquote us tearing up property, and you have no critique for the ways in which systemic racism violates us on an everyday basis, underfunds our schools, imprisons us in our own communities, continues to suffer us in our own healthcare and well-being, you can miss us with all that. Because what we don't have time for, and Dr. Palmater made this real plain, what we don't have time for is performative activism and performative leadership. So if that's what you own, you can miss us, as we say on the south side of Chicago, miss us with all that because the time is past time, right? We're talking about, Vanessa mentioned the killing of Emmett Till, right? So we're talking about 60 years, 65 years later, that even in the killing of Emmett Till just 3 years ago, Linda Bryant said, "Oh, I lied." Who was she talking to? We knew that. So we can't talk about it, right? Because there are ways in which people are using the denial of the truth to protect what it is they claim themselves to be. And so I find it not surprising that critical race theory is being banned in teaching in K through 12 education, because it's not simply about denying the truth. It's I want to socialize you. I want to miseducate you. So
I think we lost Derrick temporary again. We'll come back to him. I have another question, but before I ask it, does any one of the other members of the panel want to also address the similar question? Okay, DeRico, please go ahead.
So I guess I want to start here in terms of where we why can't we or why don't we want to talk about racism? And so I have to lead with this line is that the systems in society that we function in were not built for persons of color. We were actually left to die. We were not meant to survive. People wanted us to die. And to be frank, white colonizers wanted us to die. And by resilience of our ancestors and our people, I'm here today to be able to have a conversation because my ancestors survived. And, I want to spit a couple of facts here that people may or may not know in relation to Canada and Nova Scotia. And so Black History in Nova Scotia, Black History Month, was first recognized officially in 1988, later renamed African Heritage Month in 1996. The last residential school in Canada closed in Saskatchewan in 1996. And then the other notion that I want, I try to say it as plainly as I can because it's ridiculous, is imagine owning the land, inhabiting the land, people coming here, taking the land, murdering your people, and giving you rules for a place that you already inhabited. And so when we think about the systems and the way in which these were designed, they were meant for persons of color to die. And so policing in North America, it's in the inception began in slave catchers and night watch, formalized into the policing system we know today. The education system, we have segregated schools that have just recently closed in the 90s and have been torn down in 2014. And it's an explanation for where we are today. And so how do you win with a 400 year head start? How can you win that race? And so when we think about the construction of society and how it was actually constructed and meant to work, we were not meant to actually be here. And so thinking about the way that everything is placed. And so there's a cognitive dissonance and distancing when having a conversation about race, and especially coming from white folks. It wasn't me, it wasn't my ancestors, I'm not really sure. All of those different things, there's a distancing, and folks don't want to discuss it because discussing it is acknowledging it, and then you have to take some accountability for what has happened. And there's also, you have to look in the mirror and actually face the conversation. And so again, you might lose power. You might lose what you have. You might lose what society has afforded you. And so if I enter into this discussion, I might lose what society has afforded me. So it's a difficult and uncomfortable conversation, but imagine having to live that for the rest of your life. Thank you.
Thank you, DeRico. And I'll come back to a similar question, but there's one that is posted in the Q&A, and it refers to the model minority that Savanna talked about. And it's a long question, but I'm going to shorten it a little. And the question really is, how do the panelists see this myth being used against Asian Pacific Islander and other BIPOC, even though it may sound like a compliment? So if one of the panelists wants to respond to that, just show me by lifting your hands and I'll introduce you, or just turn on your microphone and go for it. Okay, DeRico, do you want to go?
Yeah,
and
I just
I'll
have
pass it around.
I have a quick sort of response to that. Is that I think that using the term model minority creates a dichotomous sort of delineation amongst racialized groups, which then sort of pits people against each other and creates sort of the crabs in the barrel. And so some folks may internalize the notion of model minority, and that can go up or that can go down, and that might put people against each other. And we just have to think about, again, the origin of society in terms of settlers, and using the term model minority, it was meant to divide folks. And so simply, I think that it creates a delineation and sort of crabs in the barrel, where folks may be pitted against each other.
And we do see that happening, and we saw it happening in the States, and then we saw it happening in Canada and so on, with the way that Asians were treated and linking them to the COVID-19. And Derrick, I'm sorry to say your past president, led the way on this. But coming back to the dialogue, I mean, we're talking about the difficulties and the challenges in talking about racism, and here we are having a full panel on it. Some people might think that, that the panel was useful, it was educational, they learn a lot, it might move them to do something or at least understand better. Some people might say it was just about, bashing the other. What would you say to the audience who are listening to this? Because we do get feedback on it, some positive, some negative. I want to start with you, Vanessa, and then I'll move to Pam, if that's okay.
Thank you, Dr. Talley. Everybody can hear me? I think my response to that would be exactly what I gave in my presentation. That ability to not only distance yourself, but create that denial and that fear. Because again, you are questioning the voices and questioning the words of those that are actually presenting the real and the truth, right? Speaking truth to power. And by questioning that, you're not only creating doubt, you're silencing those voices. Therefore, again, letting systemic racism and white supremacy uphold itself. So I guess I'll stop right there, but thank you.
Palmater, do you want to respond?
Well, for my part, I've always thought about education as being necessarily attached to action. That, education isn't for entertainment purposes. So that's a real misreading of education. Education is attached to action. Education at its root is about making society better, helping society, creating communities that all work together, understanding common problems, common issues. So if anyone sits back and says, I don't like this, they're all too negative, they're all the angry black folk or the angry native that we see on TV, this is just so annoying. Wow, what a luxury and a privilege that you have, that you can listen to a panel of people who represent voices who are brutalized and killed and traumatized and have been for centuries. And you can sit back and say, they were just too negative. I'm going to move on to whatever it is that's next. That's a luxury and a privilege that we don't have. If we were up here sitting, not being angry, not being passionate or hurt for the loss of human life in all of these communities, what kind of human beings would we be? If we can't be the soft place to fall and the defenders of our people, I mean, I don't get it. It's like they don't want you to be angry. They want you to say it in a nice way. But when you say it in a nice way, you can't say things that upset anybody. So you have to say nice things in a nice way that'll be accepted. You know, the number one comment I get from people when I appear in the media is, you know, if you were nicer, you might get more people to support you. And I was like, do you know, if I was nicer in the media and talked about the murders of Indigenous women and girls like it was the weather, I would be part of normalizing that like it's nothing. And I will never, ever do that. And so the government has worked very hard. The media has worked hard. The extractive industry has worked hard to not just vilify Native people. I mean, we all know that we're called militants and savages and dangerous. And, you know, RCMP come into our communities looking like the military. In fact, they've sent the military to our communities to subdue us as dangerous people, but they have constructed this good Indian and bad Indian. The good Indian is the willing partner, the one who's nice, who has nice, inspiring, hopeful messages that says, look at how much progress we have because we had a panel. And the bad Indian is the one who speaks with anger or tears or calls out the things we don't want to hear, like police being involved in child porn rings. Like nobody wants to hear that because that could be their father, their next door neighbor, or something else, and that's uncomfortable. And so we fight against that. In fact, under the previous Conservative government, they had stickers. So whenever we would go into large meetings with government officials, a certain color of sticker represented the good Indians, and a certain color of sticker represented the bad Indians, the ones that had to be monitored and surveilled and tracked and removed from the room if we raised any issues. So we have quite a battle to face. And so I would just encourage anyone who feels uncomfortable by this to really think about why you're uncomfortable. Why is this hard to hear? Why is it that you don't want to hear from the angry people, the upset people, the sad people, the ones who are crying and mourning the loss of their people? Why don't you want to hear that? Because I guarantee you, if this was reversed and happening in any town or city to all the white folk, there would be an outrage. There would be mourning. There would be statues. There would be monuments. There would be national days of, because that's what we do for other human beings. That's what we do for our families. That's what we do for our communities. Why should we be any less entitled to any of that?
Thank you. My late husband used to tell his students, knowledge and comfort do not make good bedfellows. So that's exactly what we're talking about. So I'll pass it on to Dr. Brooms.
Yes, thank you for that. I had a couple of things I wanted to add because Dr. Palmater, I told you, she got me going. So just a couple of things, right? And I had to write them down because so many thoughts were percolating. One of the things that I heard Dr. Palmater talk about is the ways in which we are still impacted by policing. And I want to make sure we understand that policing is not just the police force. So that if people have critique, commentary, and ways that they want to talk about how we bring our energy to this conversation, what they're actually engaged in is secondary and tertiary policing. They want to police us on how we all think about how power and domination work. You want to police me on how I ought to respond to your abuse, violence, and maltreatment, right? And so to me, we can just draw the line right there. That if you want to further my dehumanization and my nothingness, right, my non-humanness, then you get to dictate how I respond to your abuse. And so that's an abusive relationship. And what we're saying is we're not okay with that, right? So in a lot of ways, we're also saying that silence not only is violence, it's also complicit. so that if I see the pain and suffering in my community and then I don't say anything, then I'm actually part of the problem, right? We've got, it's old civil rights song. Which side are you on? Are you out here swinging or are you out here singing? Sometimes it's time to sing, and then other times it's time to get the foot up off the knee. As DeRico talked about earlier, we got to get the knee off our neck, and it won't be in our, as Audre Lorde said, our silence will not protect us, right? And this is where, even as I think about this notion of the modern minority, just to connect back to that, what it also talks about, as DeRico mentioned and Suzanne mentioned a bit earlier, Savanna mentioned a bit earlier, is that the notion of modern minority is intended for us to ascribe to, right, and strive to be like folks who they identify as Asian, and they're looking at very particular Asian characteristics and traits to say that those are the ones that we want to emulate, right? So notions of passivity, right? Notions of being meek, those things in and of themselves are not problematic, but what they're saying is, why are you complaining? You should just be happy to be here. Listen, I am happy to be here, and I'm still going to be upset, as James Baldwin said. Listen, to be Black and relatively conscious in a nation that is predicated upon Black suffering and violence, you ought to be in a state of rage. And if you're not, as DeRico said, I got questions for you, but I really don't want to know, right? Like, if the theft and the continuing abuse of Indigenous peoples is not something that bothers you, and you talk about you're for racial justice, you're not for racial justice, right? So we just don't have time for performative wokeness. So I'll say two more things, right? Drove to Ferguson in the days after Darren Wilson was acquitted, right? And I'm in a city in the United States where there are tanks rolling down the street. The National Guard is lined up in between the fire station and the police station. And what are they there to do? Protect property. How often has the National Guard been called for Indigenous peoples and the abuses that they've continued to experience? Why wasn't the National Guard called for anti-Asian hate? Why wasn't the National Guard called when we had these state-sanctioned violence and the mortgage crisis continue to trifle our homes and leave us in lead-infested housing in Flint, Michigan, right? So if we don't have these levels of critique, then what are we doing? And we also have to ask questions about policing in higher education, because I work at a higher education institution, and it happens to be the institution that Sam DuBose was fatally killed by an off-duty University of Cincinnati police officer, right? Who also was acquitted. So if folks get to not be held accountable and our lives are steady at risk for just trying to breathe, and you got a problem with me being a little bit of my righteous indignation, I'm okay with that, right? Because you didn't come here to learn. Thank you, Dr. Rajak Taylor.
Thank you, Derrick. Savanna, you've been a little quiet, but brave. So I want to pass the virtual talking stick to you if you have some comments to make, and then I'll come back to DeRico and Palmater and Vanessa.
I'll just quickly comment on what DeRico and Dr. Brooms said about the model minority. Often I see like Chinese people commenting on, like they have questions about Black Lives Matter and all kinds of these movements, and they give examples like, look what happened in LA riot in 1992. Look what Black people did to those Koreans, and why do we need to stand with them? So, but what concerns me the most is like why people cannot see past this. Like, why did the riot happen in the first place? Like it's so disturbing to see that people don't see the whole picture. Like I guess it's the dominant discourse. It has everything to do with dominant discourse and narratives. Like 4 white cops acquitted for killing a Black man, and that's what happened. And what happened during the riot was that when the Korean people in the Korean town were attacked, police didn't care. Like when they called the cops and they were told, well, there's nothing much we can do. I hope your store is insured. That's what happened. And people, I see like Asian people have difficulty like see this whole situation, you know, beyond. Like they only see, oh, we are attacked by Black people. And now today, why are we standing with Black Lives Matters? And yeah, I think the model minority is really, I wouldn't say good, but it's very effective in, you know, like turning people against each other under this systemic racism context. Thank you, Dr. Talley.
Thanks, Savanna. We have about 10 minutes left, and I want to pass it around to each of the panelists. And one of the things, when we talk about has the needle moved in the last year, the needle may have shifted, that we are talking more about racism and so on. But the question of systemic racism, I don't know where the needle is. I mean, I'm saying that because I don't want to answer the question. So I'm going to ask you, where is the needle on systemic racism? You know, and why is the needle where it is? And let me go in the order of which the presentations went. So I'll start with Derrick, Suzanne, DeRico, Vanessa, and then I'll end up with Dr. Palmater.
Thank you, Dr. Rajak. I want to be mindful of time, and I know I've talked a bit during our Q&A, so I'm going to err on the side of being brief because I want to respect and honor my colleagues. I think the needle is where it has been for the past several decades, right? Again, I use the phrase moments of progress very intentionally because there has been moments that we've made progress, but when we look at the larger picture, which my colleagues have pointed out, we've not made very much progress because we've seen efforts, coordinated, intentional efforts to entrench or re-entrench some of the blockages, some of the barriers, some of the obstacles to our lived experiences. And so has the needle moved? It might have shifted to the left, but I definitely wouldn't say it's moved forward. So, you know, we've got some quote unquote wins as we look at electoral politics and things like that. But listen, we are in a dire state that has been brewing, that has been cooking in this country, and then was exacerbated over the last 4 years of this particular, you know, previous president that has brought to light a number of the things that have been brewing underneath the surface. So we have a very, very long way to go. And in my estimation, the needle moved, but it was either to the left or to the right, but it didn't move forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Derrick. Savanna, any last words on that? Okay, so I'll move to DeRico for now while Savanna gets her thought together. DeRico, the same question. The needle may have been moved, that people are now talking a little bit about racism, but there's still a lot of denial on systemic racism.
So, you know, when I think about the needle, the system is, again, I go back to the inception. If you understand the history, you can conceptually think about the present. The system is doing what it was intentionally and initially designed to do. And so is the needle moving? Well, you know, I would ask for who and where, because certainly, yes, we've had a large uptake in frequency of dialogue and discussion and happenings over the year. But again, when we look at the social determinants of health for Black and Indigenous or racialized communities, where are they? We're at some of the lowest rungs within society, and these things are not being discussed. Black people in Halifax 6 times more likely to be stopped and street checked by police. Some of the highest poverty rates, some of the highest unemployment rates, racism in every single system that exists within our province. And so you know, when we discuss like has the needle moved? Well, if somebody was running a race and started 400 years before me, how can I catch them? How am I going to catch up? And so, you know, one thing I sort of want to mention here is that allyship is not a finite destination. You don't simply arrive, and it's also not a self-prescribed thing. If people from the particular community haven't invited you in or haven't deemed you to be an ally, you simply can't just call yourself one to particular groups of folks. It's not a finite destination, and I will never ever understand what it is like to be an Indigenous person. However, it's a journey that I have to and should be on for the rest of my life. And so for anybody who claims or calls themselves an ally, I cannot go home, and nor would I ever want to change the color of my skin. I have Black privilege. I'm proud to be Black. However, if you're calling yourself an ally, I have to live this for the rest of my life. And so if you're an ally, you have to put your boots on and you have to strap in for the rest of your life and fight alongside all of the racialized communities. Otherwise, you're just taking up space and you're in the way. And so as Derrick said, miss me with that.
Okay. Thank you, DeRico. We have 5 minutes of Vanessa and Dr. Palmater. If we could go a little longer, we surely would. But I just want to thank all the panelists before we just get cut off. So thank you very much. This is recorded. We will send you subsequently feedback on it. So Vanessa, go ahead.
I'll be very brief. I will just say that I guess the needle is more like a pendulum, and that sometimes it seems like we're gaining traction, and then you definitely see how the last 4 years in America have affected not only America but the world. And so the pendulum and the needle seem to swing back the other way. I'm hoping that at least those who are here tonight understand that and will question and want to move that needle and actually, again, not just have inaction, but real action. So I'm just going to leave it with one last quote. As we were talking and you mentioned about those who are questioning about this and why people still speak up. And, you know, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King said, our lives begin to end the day we become silent about things that matter. Thank you.
Thank you. And we know that Dr. Palmater is not going to be silent anytime in the future, and we are happy for that. So you have the last word for tonight.
Well, thank you. I'm honored to be a part of this. And like I said, I wrote 1,000 notes on what everyone was saying. In terms of the needle hasn't moved for Indigenous peoples, we still have an Indian Act that legislates our extinction in the future. We have CSIS and the RCMP who are engaged in monitoring our every move. Our culture is still criminalized. Systemic racism and genocide is in this game of bob and weave. You know, they're dip, dodge, duck, and dive, and anything to deflect, ignore, deny, detract, anything but deal with it. But here's why I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful from hearing all of these voices here because we are the change. They're not going to give us anything. We march, we fight, we yell, we're angry, we push for change in every form, in the courts, at the United Nations, in our communities. We assume the responsibility, and that's why change has come, and that's why change will come. And I think we're so much stronger together in solidarity. I mean, when we were in the streets during Idle No More, Black Lives Matter had our back. And when Black Lives Matter was in the street, you know Idle No More was there. And the more we bring in more and more and more communities, you know, solidarity with Stop Asian Hate and violence against women and anti-poverty and anti-destruction of the earth, that's what's going to get it done. It's our power. So as overwhelming as these barriers are in society that's been created and reinforced, we have the power to smash and dismantle all of that. We just have to continue to take action and work together as a family.
Thank you, Dr. Palmater. And again, I would like to thank all the panelists. For those of you who are out there, it may appear that we are comfortable speaking about this, but none of us are. It's always a challenge, it's always emotional, it's always a toll. And I am with Dr. Palmater. I am hopeful because not only would we continue, but the young people will continue. Mm-hmm. You know, and I want to especially thank our students and continue to encourage our students to be on this panel. And, you know, we will continue to speak truth to power and organize this forum. After each session, we always question ourselves, would we do this again? Would we do this again? And then all you have to do is turn on the news, you know, and there's 1,000,001 reasons why we need to do this. I want to thank you all, and I want to thank my crew. As I said, we are all volunteers, and they come out of the holidays to do this. And this is, again, because of the commitment of a few could have a big impact to many. So thank you, and to you, the audience, good night, and stay safe and be well.